My name is Steve Katz. Oops. Good afternoon. My name is Steve Katz. I'm a healthcare consultant, and our talk today will be about financings, primarily in the early stage and Series A, a little bit of Series B, and novel features associated with those financings. We're going to discuss some details. I am a healthcare consultant. I do strategy, licensing, tech transfer, sit on boards, proxy fights, turnarounds, and I've been doing that for 40 years now. I've got a bunch of prior corporate experience. My panelists today are Dr. Tomas Philipson, who's sitting next to me. Tom is a managing partner at Meda Ventures. It's a healthcare venture capital firm. We invest broadly across various healthcare sectors. They do about 1 to 3 million on an initial check. They do follow-on financing. Tom has an enormous amount of background and experience. He is a healthcare economist. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Chicago, a former co-chair of the White House Council on Economic Advisors, and a former chief economist at the US FDA and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. On top of all that wealth of experience, he's managed to start a business and sell it to Blackstone. And there's a novel aspect associated with Meda, which I'm going to leave Tom to explain as we go into discussion. Our next speaker is Norm Friedland, who many of you may know. He is a co-founder of FullSky, and he is the elder gentleman on the screen. FullSky specializes in proprietary financing strategies associated with non-dilutive fundings that come from private foundations that have a variety of novel advantages. Third panelist is David Whelan, who is a healthcare strategist based in California. David has significant CEO, CFO operating experience, as well as extensive venture capital experience, and is currently advising a significant VC on the West Coast. So that's our panel. And I'm going to start off by having Tom, unless you want to comment further about your background, I'm going to ask you the first question. That would be, what is unique and novel about Meda Ventures versus other healthcare VCs?
Sure. Thanks for having us. So we are basically, there's three differentiating aspects, I think, that are important. One is that it's a very doctor-centered, so the customers of the products or drugs that we are essentially investing in are actually making the investment decisions. So we have also very high presence in sort of the academic institutions that are leads many times in the use of new medical technology. Many times it comes out of academic medical centers and then spreads across the center. So we have professors at Harvard, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, Columbia, University of Chicago, essentially associated with our team, and they are offering very useful expertise on new developments in those centers, essentially. That kind of advantage of having people who are customers being the investors in the fund or being partners in the fund has led us to about a 40 plus IRR so far. We're kind of, we're aggregating up from a previous angel fund into this new venture fund. And also has us on target potentially with a unicorn in terms of vaccines with the cancer vaccine, and was really discovered by one of our managing partners, essentially, sort of illustrating the model that having that deep sort of medical expertise among the partners is really what's driven our most successful investments. There's two other aspects, I think, that are unique. One is I'm on a board called GATC for the components of DNA, GATC Health in California, which is the leading AI company in assessing molecule success in humans, essentially. It's a merger of a team from the Human Genome Project together with the team from eBay. that has formed a company. And they're the only company that has, there's a lot of sort of talk in this space, but they're the only company that has a third-party validation of their technology. They went to UC Irvine Chemistry Department, and UC Irvine Chemistry Department sent them 10,000 molecules to evaluate whether they were working or not. Oh my God. And they were correct 85% of the time. Now compare that with drug or phase-specific investments into drugs, which are many, many times, below a 45% success rate. That's almost a doubling of the success rate in having that technology at hand. So I think we're going to collaborate a lot with GATC. I think that's going to be important for us in terms of in the drug space, how we select investments, given their demonstrated ability by a third party to be exceptionally valuable in assessing molecule quality. The second...
Before you go on further, I wanted to raise a comment. I've worked with a lot of universities and licensed technology off of university campuses numerous times. And the problem that I've run into, VCs that I've run into, the investors who are sophisticated and want to commercialize this technology is university technology almost always is very, very, and one more very early. And, a lot of the research protocols are not done in connection with a commercial grade of protocols. They need to be redone. How do you deal with the fact that you're working with these, and maybe you're not working with super early ones, but how do you deal with the whole notion of academic and early versus commercial standards? How do you overcome that hurdle?
That actually leads me to the third component. The two first one was the academic sort of focus or expertise within the partnership. The second one was the relationship to what we perceive the industry leader in AI selection of molecules. The third one has to do with failing. How do you protect yourself essentially against failing molecules because of early or other reasons, teams behind them? So we have developed, Meda has developed the product for Lloyd's of London, which is now going to be launched. It is being launched this month, that are going to insure biotechs against the failure of a clinical trial, meaning their endpoint is not met in the clinical trial. So if you invest $10 million or $50 million, what have you, in a trial, and your main endpoint is insignificant, Lloyd's is going to insure that expense. You're going to get your money back. So that's going to be extremely valuable for our portfolio companies because now we can limit their downside risk, essentially. It's also very, very valuable for philanthropic or foundational investments because instead of investing in one molecule, you can now invest in multiple premiums of several companies. And then the companies can easily raise the money once the molecule is insured, or the trial is insured, I should say. So instead of investing $10 million in one molecule, you invest $3 million in premium to insure the molecules for 3 different companies. Those 3 companies are now downwardly protected and can go out and raise money easily because they're basically they can go to equity or bond investors and say, if our trial fails, you get your money back.
Spreading the risk that creates part B to my question. If I understand it correctly, the insurance policy relates to a clinical protocol, but often we're dealing with a substantial amount of research and funding and testing that has to be done pre-IND, prior to the approval to commence clinicals. Do the policies that you're organizing with Lloyd's pertain to that testing as well?
No, they're basically, right now, they're targeted at phase 1 and phase 2, less than $25 million trials.
Right.
And that's the target. We will go up to phase 3, obviously, if this is successful. We also secured a capital provision agreement with one of the biggest PE firms, which you all recognize who it is once it gets announced, who's going to lend against this insurance. So now you're going to have secured debt for biotechs because basically you can lend against the insurance. The investor or the PE company gets paid by Lloyd's when the trial fails. So the debt is secure that way. And the company gets less diluted when they succeed, essentially. So
it's a debt financing, so there's no dilution. And the private equity firm supplies the debt with the backup guarantee of Lloyd's.
Right.
Okay, that's very clever.
I can augment that early stage part.
Please.
We don't invest. I'm part of Meda Ventures too, managing partner with Tomas, Elizabeth. We don't invest at the very earliest when they're just spun out. They have to be pretty, it's late seed series A. So they
we're beyond proof of concept. Yeah.
For sure. We won't invest in academic science projects. I get it.
Pre-phase two?
Pardon me?
Pre-phase two?
Way pre-phase two, like
it's pre-IND, it's pre-phase one.
Pre-IND, phase one, phase two. Yes. I'm a scientist turned investor, so I hear you about the risks. I get it.
Pardon?
I get it. Yeah.
So you've answered the question. You're going in, I would call it, for lack of a better term, a demonstrable proof of concept and a functional model that demonstrates efficacy. We don't worry about safety, but you've got some kind of efficacy, some kind of animal model probably, and you're beyond that early risk. You also
have a science project, not a science project.
That's a great phrase. It's not a science project.
There's a question from the audience online about what's the cost of the insurance?
Well, it depends on the risk of the drug class and the phase, right? So we have you have the traditional FDA data on failure rates in drug classes and phases that will drive the risk of the molecule essentially. But then obviously there's a Lloyd's underwriting team that is involved in this, and that's negotiated together with the interest rate on the loan. But substantially, put it this way, instead of raising the cost of the trial through a VC that takes the majority of your company, essentially you're now only raising the premium amount, which is much less than the cost of the trial, because you're only insuring the trial. So there's a lot lower raise, and we also it's going to basically streamline it, so it's only going to go in 3 months to do this secure debt financing, as opposed to a year or a year and a half, which it takes to line up the VC many times.
So you also mentioned, if I think I heard you correctly, that it's a clinical whose size is no greater than 25 million, so that automatically localizes.
Initially, it depends. Initially, successful, it goes up quickly.
Sure. But that localizes it to a smaller number of patient participants, level of claims, efficacy, drug claims, so on and so forth.
That's typical of phase 1 and 2.
Very typical.
So they right size matched.
Very typical. You're right.
How long does it take for the Lloyd's to underwrite something like this? So I think it's a fairly complicated process.
Yeah, no, it's 2 to 3 months is the goal. And we have a timeline that we developed, NDA takes a week, and then underwriting takes a month, and then going back on term sheets, etc. So we're trying to keep it within 3 months. That's our kind of goal, and that's what we're selling the product at.
So, Tom, you've commented on this, but if you could amplify with some specificity, how is this translated into return on investment, profitability, ROI, valuations?
Yeah, I mean, for us as a fund, essentially, I think in this tough environment, she outlined, I think, which is correct, this is going to be a great relief for some of these biotechs, I think. If they can I view this sort of better than equity when they succeed in the trial, better than debt when they fail in the trial, because they're now not going bankrupt because Lloyd's is covering the loan, essentially.
I think it's a huge advantage to have somebody step in and underwrite the success of a clinical. That's an enormous level of risk, and I think these underwriters obviously know how to cherry pick the projects, but I think that's enormously significant.
Yeah, and we will be co-investing many times with Lloyd's, because once their underwriting has been done, that's a very strong signal for us. We know the underwriting process that they're undertaking, essentially.
It's a validation.
Yeah, so Meda will basically co-investment, because the Lloyd's coverage is only for the trial expenses, not for the full series, for example, DNA or whatever. They're basically other costs that they need to raise. So there's plenty of room for Meda to sort of co-invest on the side.
Do they pay for the clinical monitors and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, whatever the trial expense is will be covered in the insurance.
Okay. What macro trends do you see happening in healthcare, as you're clearly very wired, and given all your involvements and Elizabeth's involvements, you're obviously very wired to the tone and the tenor of what's taking place. What trends do you see? What do you see happening today? What can you tell us about where things are moving? because of the traffic pattern that you have and you get exposed to?
Well, I think I've been pretty focused on the biopharma space in my work. Like you said, I was heavily involved with FDA and also CMS on the drug side in my previous life. And the company I co-founded was serving probably the 50 pharma companies. So I've been very, very focused on that. Also in legislation in terms of macro trend, I've been very involved in sort of evaluating IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the drug pricing control in that act. I think something that people need to realize about those drug pricing controls is that the statute says that it's based on spending, not on price, whether you're going to get regulated on price. That's an issue because, and it turns out the 10 first drugs they selected that will be controlled were not expensive drugs. They were high spending drugs because of a high volume, but the prices were actually pretty low. So in fact, the low prices probably contributed to the high volume. So essentially, the act is set up to go after high-spending drugs when the purpose is really to go after high-priced drugs. So that has a lot of implications for big drug classes. So GLP-1s, for example, all of them are going to get regulated regardless of their price because the volume is going to be so high.
That's a very interesting observation because what we have in many corridors are extremely expensive new therapeutics that the annual cost to deliver the therapeutics is $150,000 to $200,000. We broke through the $100,000 barrier 5 years ago, and now we're going to 200. So it's interesting that you.
Yeah, it's not the price. So my previous company served Gilead when they launched Sovaldi with their analytics essentially, and they had exactly the same experience because Gilead Sovaldi Hep C was basically the first time we had a high per capita cost coupled up with a high prevalence. You had much higher orphan drugs, higher priced orphan drugs at the time, but they were very low prevalence.
Yeah, and a very narrow market.
Exactly. So that's the issue that basically I think it's the same thing that's going to happen with the IRA. IRA is going to go after the big markets. It's very poorly designed policy because it's basically telling you if you innovate something that's great for a lot of patients, that's cheap, the government's going to come after you. That's not a good incentive, essentially, to set up for drug innovation. That's exactly the type of drugs you don't want regulated.
Without a question. The last question I have, rather lengthy, so I'm going to read it. There are leading healthcare diseases like cancer, diabetes, heart failure, obesity that really burden and impose on patients' wallets. How does your approach stave off that problem? That's another problem besides the high cost of therapeutics. How does what you're doing manage that?
Well, I think medical innovation for a lot of diseases, which are behaviorally induced, essentially. We talk about, preventable disease. They're not preventable easily because if they were, there wouldn't be diseases around. So people talk about it, behavior being very cheap to change, but it's not. So obesity COVID is a very good one. Where behaviorally avoiding face-to-face interaction could be done has enormous costs because the whole economy collapsed when we did that. And medical innovation was much cheaper to prevent the growth of COVID, essentially, with the vaccines and therapeutics that came out. And many times I believe that's the case, that medical innovation is the cheaper version, is a much cheaper way to prevent disease than behavioral change. Obesity is another one. Obesity is, in my view, driven by past innovation that was successful, mainly agricultural innovation. We couldn't produce the number of calories we consume today 100 years ago, even if it wasn't feasible to have the whole population being overweight, given our agricultural technology. We had, in the past, we had 95% of GDP went to agriculture, and we produced less calories than 2% of the population today.
Thank you, McDonald's and Burger King.
It's not that. It's just a very useful productivity change in agriculture that set up the obesity. On top of it, we had other technologies at work which made us sedentary at work. So we used to get paid to exercise because we turn a living, you have to sweat in manual labor. Today we pay to exercise, which is not so much in gym fees, but foregone leisure. Instead of being with your family after work, you have to go to a gym, etc. That's a high cost for a lot of people. So I think medical innovation in obesity, which we're seeing now with the GLP-1s, etc., is a much cheaper alternative to reducing obesity than behavioral change, which is very, very costly. Very costly because very few people can do it. Not costly in dollar terms, but in effort and willpower.
As you say, a lower success rate.
Yeah, exactly. We have 2/3 of the population obese, essentially. The other one, I think, which we've done a lot of work on, is also on cancer screening as opposed to treatment. So we just came out with a new analysis on essentially what the value of past cancer screenings, what the potential value could be if people follow the guidelines. They don't. Very few people do. But it still has saved a lot of lives for the people that do. I'm involved with Grail, the company that's basically developed the 50 cancer blood test, essentially, and I think that's going to dramatically increase the use of cancer screening in an effective manner. I think that technology may or may not soon be covered by Medicare, but I think if it is, this is going to be an enormous step forward in terms of reaching more people more cheaply, achieving cancer screening. Compare that to a colonoscopy, where you're going to the bathroom for half a day and then you're dead the next day, essentially, and as opposed to taking a finger prick with a blood test. So I think, those kinds of technologies, I think, is going to be extremely valuable going forward.
A quick question though. So a lot of these are like diagnostic, but diagnostic doesn't have a great history of being paid for by insurance well. So how do you work that out? You're preventing a disease that gives the pharmaceutical companies millions of dollars of revenue, right? So I'm looking at it from the pharmaceutical company point of view.
Well, the beneficiaries of health plans are going to demand that if you screen them for a particular cancer, if you can't get care on your health plan, you might want to switch plan, right? So the insurance companies cover a bunch of stuff that they don't necessarily reap the benefit of because there's such turnover in insurance. That's the big issue with prevention in insurance, because once you prevent something, it might be 10 years before it pays off. And then you're with a different insurance company. So the first insurance company has to pay you for your prevention that they don't see the benefit from down the line when you're with another employer or when you're in Medicare, for that matter, essentially. So, but beneficiaries are demanding, they will demand care for a diagnosed cancer. And if it's very cheap to diagnose that cancer, the insurance company doesn't have to be the one that allowed them to diagnose it, essentially.
Okay. The cancer, your interest in cancer and the work you're doing in cancer, and Marty's question about diagnostics is an excellent lead into our next speaker, which is Norm Friedland. He is the co-founder of FullSky. And I know that what Norm does and what he's going to describe is going to be relevant to your last comments. So Norm, why don't you take a moment and give everyone your background in some greater detail. And I'd like to then ask you the first question, which is very germane to the last thoughts that Tom had.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Thomas. Marty, putting together a great panel. My background is in the venture capital technology transfer space, and what FullSky is doing is taking our business expertise, our finance expertise, and presenting it to funders, specifically foundations, which have enormous amounts of assets, and presenting them with opportunities of using those assets in an IRS-approved way to support the kinds of solutions that Thomas and Elizabeth have been speaking about, most specifically the cancer screenings that were alluded to just a minute ago.
Yeah, we call that diagnostics and therapeutic screening, to be precise. So what are the benefits of one to a private foundation that's a part of a family office, by way of illustration, in making what you call program-related investment, PRI, to an early stage life science company engaged in the development of a diagnostic or a therapeutic, and B, what's the benefit to the early stage company for participating in such a financing structure?
I think Norm might have a Norm, there was a question.
Yes, so the answer is the private foundation or the DAF, that money's already been allocated. You're not looking for a family office to make an investment decision. They've allocated that money to the private foundation. And what we're saying to that private foundation that has a healthcare mandate or a healthcare mission is, look, by working with companies identified by Thomas and Elizabeth and other companies, you can impactfully use that foundation money in ways that are fiduciarily responsible, but also give you the opportunity of getting a return on that money. Because what we're packaging for these private foundations is a story where the science has been validated, the due diligence has been validated in terms of IP, the management, which has an authentic commitment and expertise in the science and in the regulatory and commercialization. They've been vetted, and the transaction costs, the documentation for this is now much more efficient than if you're trying to do it in a one-off fashion by one particular foundation. And just following up, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the impact of those dollars in the screening space is just enormous. You're talking about literally saving hundreds of billions of dollars, and I think Thomas has developed some metric called the value of life, and the value of life is from these screenings is also in the trillions of dollars.
Okay, now what about the benefits to the early stage company accepting these funds? Could you comment on that a little bit, please?
Sure. So the benefit is you're looking at essentially non-dilutive funding because the IRS requirements for a PRI are such that it needs to be aligned with mission, but it can't be made for economic benefit to the private foundation. So the private foundation can get a return of its capital with a below market interest. It's usually in a 5 to 7 year note that's a balloon. There's no collateral, there's no personal guarantees. So it's very, very attractive capital for the company, for the current investors. It's subordinate to current and future investors. And so it becomes a very, very powerful tool in the capital stack of a company.
Okay, so can you comment on the degree of complication or paperwork or legal issues, business issues associated with providing financing of this type, whether it's to a privately held company, a not-for-profit for that matter, or any other type of entity that's doing research? Can you share with us, are there implications? Is this complex to implement?
The answer is it's not rocket surgery. It's essentially a fairly standard note purchase agreement that has a few additional covenants and representations and warranties to satisfy IRS regulations. And what we've developed is the template for that note purchase agreement, so that the transaction costs are significantly minimized.
That's good to know. Can you also comment on the following? Obviously, you and I have spoken, and PRIs are not novel. They were pioneered over 40 years ago with the Ford Foundation. Why have we not heard much more about them? Why are they not more commonly referred to, more prevalent? I don't know how much they've been used. And prior to speaking to you, I've been in the venture licensing, biotech device space a long time. I actually never heard of them until you and I really started to chat about this. So can you share some of that with us?
Well, I put all the blame on Marty Cicada. I mean, we should have been talking about this when he started the Ivy Family Office Network Conference, Marty. But no, seriously.
You want Marty to leave the room?
I mean, a lot of things.
First time I'm blamed for something.
Yeah, a lot of things have come together. First of all, the life science advances that have occurred in the last 5 years are spectacular. Whether it's in the therapeutic or diagnostic space, stuff that we have today sounded like science fiction 5 years ago, and stuff we're going to have 5 years from now is going to make what we have today look pretty prosaic. So that's number one. Number two, you've got a tsunami of wealth transfer that's occurring from my generation to Steve, your generation, and our kids' generation, where the stewards of that money are looking for much greater impact for their philanthropic dollars. And so those two factors, together with the need that these disease solutions have to be delivered. I mean, you're talking about 30 or 40 million Americans who have, quote, rare diseases, for which there is currently no treatment. And there's not only no treatment, there's no possible treatment, even in a pipeline. So all of these factors are coming together, and FullSky, with thanks to Marty and thanks to you, Steve, is really in the forefront of telling this story and reaching out to not only to the family offices, but to the wealth managers who need to have this information in their arsenal for their clients.
Okay. As a result of what Thomas had to say about investing in early stage companies, specifically with cancer screening, therapeutics, diagnostics, would you clarify the applicability of your type of financing strategy to those target companies, and give us a flavor for the relevancy and whether that's a fit or not?
So there are several examples. What I can talk about, we're working with a liquid biopsy company called AccuMark that has what we believe to be the grail of liquid biopsies for cancer. That's going to be transformative. Genomic Expression, which is another client of ours, is looking at analyzing saliva in ways that can predict not only look at the disease, but also look at how the treatment a person's getting is progressing. And PRIs are essential for these kinds of companies exactly because of the reimbursement issues that cause the private investors to step away from diagnostic companies. I think it took Exact Science, which has the Cologuard technology, 4 or 5 years before they could get reimbursement for that diagnostic. Now, Exact Sciences had the money to hang in there, but very few companies have that kind of resource. So the PRI money, which is patient money, which is looking for impact and not ROI, return on a quarterly or annual basis, is essential. Moving over to what Thomas alluded to in terms of the insurance, the clinical trial insurance, we believe that PRI capital can substantially support the funding of these premiums, because now you've got impact on impact on impact, and we're looking forward to having those discussions with Thomas and Elizabeth and their colleagues to present the PRI story to these foundations and the wealth managers.
Okay, thank you. Anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask? Thomas alluded, do you have any questions for Norm about the relevancy of PRI financing and how it might fit into your world?
Well, I think the way I view it is that you increase for all these philanthropic.
Sorry about that.
For all these philanthropic and foundational investments, you can greatly increase the productivity of those. So we're in discussion with American Cancer Society, for example. They want to do something in pancreatic research because, you know, you die immediately when you get pancreatic cancer. We don't have a lot of solutions. So instead of them pushing one single company in that way, they are now interested in buying premiums for multiple companies that then can easily raise the money after they're done buying the premium for the trial. The companies can go out on their own and raise the money because the investors have downward protection when the trial fails, which is usually when they lose all their money.
So you're raising an interesting point, and you described this earlier. Right now, you're doing this for phase 1 and phase 2. You've indicated that downstream, you'll be doing it for phase 3, presumably for larger clinicals, for larger amounts, because phase 2 is geometrically a higher number than phase 1, and phase 3 is significantly a geometrically higher number than phase 2. What's next after phase 1, phase 2, phase 3?
Well, that's a pretty big deal because it's like, you know, I don't know, what is it, 400 billion a year or something worldwide. But I think the hope is to go to phase 3. I mean, both the investor that's going to have a secure debt instrument against the insurance, they're dipping their toe essentially with $250 million on the first attempt, and then they want to go up to, you know, multiples of that very quickly if it's successful. We are having very, very good traction with the brokers. We had a couple of brokers calls starting last month who have a lot of biotechs who are interested in this product now. So I think we're going to have traction. Yeah.
So let me just comment. I think the next speaker is Sean Kowalski from Stand Up to Cancer. And Thomas and Elizabeth, I think he's going to be your new best friend on what you're doing.
Yeah, we certainly hope so. We're willing to work with anyone, obviously. So if there's anyone here that has people that are interested in this, more than happy to have a discussion afterwards.
And you guys will be at dinner as well. So what about David Whelan? Is he spoken yet?
David Whelan is going to be speaking next. So Norm, thank you. Tom, again, thank you. Our next panelist is David Whelan, who's a healthcare consultant and a strategist. David has substantial operating experience as a CEO and COO, has worked with VC funds in the past, and is currently advising a significant VC on the West Coast. And David, could you just amplify a bit on your background with some specifics, and we can do some discussion and questions in a moment.
Absolutely. So thanks again, Marty. Really appreciate the invitation. Steve, thanks for making the conversation happen. And Norm, good to see you again on our weekly panel. It's always exciting. And Elizabeth, great to see you in the audience there. So Dave Whelan, based in Los Angeles, and spent the past 4 years running an organization called Bioscience LA, which is a nonprofit ecosystem catalyst, really growing connectivity around life sciences and healthcare innovation in LA and connecting it to the rest of the country, rest of the world. And did that after many years of working with startups, growing companies in healthcare across technologies, from wearables to genomics to cancer diagnostics to healthcare data. So I like to say I'm neither a physician nor a scientist, but I've spent a lot of time helping to translate between physicians and scientists and investors and attorneys and everyone who help make businesses happen.
Okay. Would you comment on the global opportunity for healthcare investment versus what we have here in the U.S.? A little bit of a different approach, but we're going to tie it back together to the main discussion as we proceed forward.
Absolutely. I think the conversations we've just had are great, great segue into that. I think that, certainly for many years, healthcare has been an increasingly global industry, and investing has really followed that trend. As I said, I'm based in LA, although I'm beaming in from LA or Las Vegas right now. And in LA, we still look back to several years ago. The largest healthcare deal was Gilead's acquisition of Kite Pharma, which is a company that had Israeli roots, and so big deals happening, connecting the world. And as we've become more comfortable with virtual collaboration, events like this where half of us are coming in over Zoom, some of that's been driven by pandemic, of course. I think we're seeing more and more ways to team up on global healthcare collaborations. In fact, some of the solutions coming out of COVID were created by international collaboration. And in my mind, healthcare is one of these truly global, truly international problems and solutions. Humans are humans around the world. And so while there's different opportunities in different parts of the world, a cancer solution that we develop here in the US is something that's likely going to have relevance around the globe. As you look at smaller companies that are looking for market opportunities in the US in the healthcare world, they're doing that because it's the largest market. It's also the most complex market. And so if you're a healthcare startup and you're trying to find your US opportunity, once you've solved that, once you can thrive in the US healthcare market, you can take on the world. On the flip side, US health companies that are not looking at their EU or UK markets, not looking at Asia markets, they're really missing big chunks of the world, not to mention Latin America, Africa, both of which are major growth markets for healthcare innovation. And so, come back to this, but, you mentioned the work that I'm doing in the venture world. For the past several years, I've been collaborating with a firm called Wavemaker 360 Health, which is an LA-based seed and Series A venture firm, 100% healthcare. And on the third fund right now, I'm working with them to bring on board a global network where we introduce new global LPs with a passion for healthcare to the firm to create new deal flow from around the world, but doing that in a way where it's not just deal flow, it's now building a bi-directional or multi-directional network to help those non-US companies get access to the US market, as well as help the US portfolio companies get access to the non-US market opportunities.
Okay, so as an extension of the first question, how do regional communities help fuel the growth of healthcare technology and growth of healthcare in general?
Yeah, and that's great. That's really how I got into what I'm doing right now. As I said, I was spent 4 years running a nonprofit ecosystem catalyst called Bioscience LA that was growing LA's life sciences innovation community. And if we think about the traditional life sciences hubs, Bay Area, San Diego, Boston are the three that typically come to mind. And outside of those, to some extent, I'll say it's been a challenge to create strong innovation hubs. The team there sitting in New York, I think, New York and LA are really interesting examples because both of those regions have tremendous academic and healthcare resources. They've got large non-dilutive funding bases, large equity funding bases. You've got big trained or trainable workforces. You've got room for infrastructure. And so you've got all of these pieces. What's needed are organizations, in LA, Bioscience LA, in New York, you've got New York Bio, and, as well as the public sector organizations, LA EDC, NYC EDC. These organizations build bridges between the public sector, the private sector, start to create these new opportunities to grow funding, to grow space, to grow talent. And we see this not just in big places like New York and LA. As I've traveled around the past few years, and you look at emerging life sciences hubs, Texas is seeing a lot more growth across Houston, across Austin, but even Dallas now, where ARPA-H has one of its hubs. North Carolina, Atlanta, Denver, Seattle. what we're really seeing are these regional groups connecting public and private resources to be able to find the best innovations, in some cases help get them out of the academic institutions, team up with the right organizations, which is where I think the work that Norm is doing is great, because there's ways to connect new kinds of funders to some of these regional innovations, and then finding paths to get into the Meda Angels of the world, the Wavemaker 360 Health of the world.
Okay.
And just one more comment on that, because I think, LA and New York, again, really special places because of their diversity, their population diversity, their industry diversity, cultural diversity. The world's populations live in both LA and New York. And so when it comes to healthcare, we're able to create these ability for increasingly diverse researchers to build increasingly diverse clinical trials, very important in the cancer world, that will be developing products that will be delivered by increasingly diverse physicians to an increasingly diverse patient population. And I think that's where all of these investment efforts could really come together.
Okay, thank you. We spent a fair amount of time discussing what Tom and Elizabeth and Norm are doing in the diagnostics, early detection, therapeutic space. Where do you see this space going in the future? What is its outlook from your perspective?
Yeah, and I think this is, again, this is something that has been around for a long time. Funding for diagnostics has not been at the same level as funding for therapeutics, but nor has attention. I think that pandemic, again, was one of these, the silver lining of pandemic is that, everyone started to pay attention to diagnostics. And I mentioned I've done work in the genomics world. Norm just mentioned genomics technologies. I think the opportunities for leveraging more, deeper genomics panels to build advanced diagnostic tests, to build even these longitudinal wellness tests, which, to Marty's point, Marty and I think the whole room's point, the more we focus on wellness, the more we focus on prevention and early diagnostics, that does change the model for the therapeutics companies. But I think if we look at it from a healthcare market standpoint, where the whole idea is how do we both create value along the entire value chain, but also move some of these costs earlier. So go from therapeutics to diagnostics, go from diagnostics to prevention and wellness. All of these are creating opportunities where companies and investors can find ways to capitalize. It's just with a different twist on the market. Overlaying that, we saw, again, during pandemic, remote patient monitoring, point of care diagnostics. All of these are not new technologies, but ones where we've now kind of opened up the floodgates, or at least maybe not floodgates. We've opened up the faucet a little bit. We can turn them into floodgates a bit by identifying more and better ways to fund research, to invest in research that's starting to make an impact sooner on a greater population.
Question, please.
It's more of a comment. I think all this talk on diagnostics, has been somewhat grim. But I think even therapeutics companies are looking to invest because there are companion diagnostics, things that will predict and therefore funnel into their therapeutics. So pharma is also still willing to invest. So it's, I think, brighter than we have historically seen.
Yeah.
I would agree with you. I've been involved in funding a lot of different companies over the years. There's no question that diagnostics are not as popular as therapeutics, but if you analyze things, you're going to find out that diagnostic tees up the therapeutic in many instances. So it's like a necessary younger brother, older brother, earlier opportunity. So I'm not sure that it's not a good relationship. Diagnostics aren't as popular as new devices and new drugs. There's no question about that. But I agree. But I think that diagnostics are here to stay, particularly with the advent of AI.
Okay.
But
Yep.
Did you want to say anything about that? I want to ask David. So David, we spent a lot of time talking about diagnostics, therapeutics, and costs for healthcare going up. What is your perspective from what you see in the world and in the marketplace about how do we slow down the growth of the curve associated with these costs? How do we break that momentum down a little bit and bring costs down? What are some of the things that ought to be considered in your view to modulate cost in healthcare?
Yeah. And again, I think you actually just teed this up really well with the point about, or Elizabeth with companion diagnostics, and then Steve, your point about the relationship between these. Here in the U.S. in particular, the idea of value-based healthcare, I think, remains somewhat elusive, but we continue to see more focus on value throughout the delivery of healthcare, which the goal there is to keep the pressure on costs while still keeping quality high, keeping the impacts high, and some of the new funding mechanisms that were mentioned here, I think, will ultimately go a long way to helping bring new solutions to market earlier and hopefully less expensively. I don't know if we're in for a big day of reckoning or if it's just slowly chipping away at some of the costs across the entire value chain of healthcare. But clearly there's an opportunity to be more efficient throughout that value chain, and that both reduces costs for the system, but it also creates value opportunities for the companies or the organizations that are actually doing the work there. And again, I'll flip it back to international for a moment, because I think that is one of the opportunities, even as we look at the increasingly diverse international market, trying to identify innovations that are happening wherever they're happening. So this is maybe outside of the traditional Silicon Valley in Boston. It's elsewhere in the US, it's elsewhere in the world, where there's an opportunity potentially to get access to innovations at a fraction of the cost that are coming out of Silicon Valley, and then fund those innovations in a way where we can start to bring better technologies, better solutions to market, both faster, but also at a lower cost, which is then again going to create more of an opportunity to improve that entire cost structure, bend the curve in a bigger way.
We have a question.
Yeah, I heard that Mark Cuban was forming a generic drug company of some kind. I don't know anything about it, but I was just curious what your thoughts are and if you knew anything about it.
Tom, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so he basically is trying to circumvent the PBMs, as far as I understand. So it's basically, it's going to have, a certain margin on production costs. There's no R&D costs for generics, so there's only manufacturing costs. So there's a lot of overpricing of those generics.
Yeah.
And so he's basically launching a company that is, I don't know what it is, 10 or 15% margin on manufacturing costs. Is going to be way cheaper than many times the generics are sold through the PBMs, essentially. I actually interacted with him quite a bit at the White House. So we might try to get him involved with his voice thing as well.
That would be good.
Okay. David, I think that clearly what FullSky and what Meda are doing can clearly have a potential and significant impact on the escalating costs associated with healthcare. I think that's been reasonably plain to see based on the discussions today. So are there any further questions from the audience? Okay, I think that brings us, we have, I'm sorry.
The corner.
Yes.
You've hit me over the head many times on the management team that must be in place to take these drugs and therapeutics to the next level.
Yes, I've hit you many times over the head.
Can you comment on that?
I'm sorry. The question is,
Can you
speak about the necessity of a competent management team?
Yes.
I think that axiomatically, they talk about real estate and they say there's three things that drive real estate. They say location, location, location. Look, I think you can have a great technology, great IP, a great distribution channel, a great clinical, a great product development program. And if you can't manage it, it's not going to go anyplace. So we've had this conversation many times, John. I think the management team is quintessential to the success of all the other things that need to be in place. And God knows there's a lot that needs to be in place before a competent management team can effectively execute. But when you pull this all together, if you don't have a competent management team to execute, David knows this, I know this, having run numerous turnarounds. If you don't have that capability, it's not going to get off the starting block. I think that's a very important point, and thank you for bringing that up.
That's a key diligence point. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm going to call it my rule of three. You want an executive, you want a visionary, and you want a really great engineer.
So you know what, Marty? I don't disagree with that precept, but
just throwing it out there.
Let me tell you, pardon?
Just throwing it out there.
So I'm gonna react to that comment. And again, having been on numerous boards, proxy fights, all this, all that, I've come to see that companies need a different brand and genre of leadership in different stages. The founder, who is often an MD or a PhD, periodically an engineer, sometimes a financial executive. I think that's great for phase one, and I don't mean phase one clinical testing. I mean, for the initial phase of a company. So let's say that's a inception to a 2 or 3 or to a 4 year window, and the company's at a threshold level of revenues, and it needs a more professional manager, someone with a track record of being able to operate, grow revenues, motivate employees, develop programs to grow the business. And then when businesses get to a certain level, it needs what I think is a very professional CEO who's going to take it from 250 million that it might be to the 5 billion that it can be, whether the number is 250 or 500 million or 100 million. Variable, and that depends, and there are no bright lines. But my experience has been just a bit different. I've come to see that companies evolve in terms of their executive leadership, C-suite leadership roles.
Sure, I think that you'll find that whatever stage they're at, whether they're like a late stage private company or they are a public company, that there's a grouping of that skill set that you need to have.
There's no question, and there's a grouping clearly, and there's also a grouping of skill sets associated with publicly held technologies, because I'm working on one situation right now where a private company CEO is now running a public company, and there's a couple of things that need to be learned. The gentleman was about to say something.
I'm curious, from your perspective, do you, in your history or your experience, do you generally find the more senior guy first that comes in at the lower level and works his way, builds the company and stays with it? Or do you have to constantly replace the management? From your perspective, what have you seen?
I'll tell you what I've seen. I've seen companies get created by founders, and the useful life, I hate to be so impersonal, the useful life of that founder is finite because he just lacks or she lacks certain skill sets. They got it out of the test tube, they got it out of the petri dish, they got it through the clinicals or partway through the clinicals, and not even through phase 2 or phase 3 clinicals. And it needs the next level of capability. So I think that what happens is there's an equilibrium within the company. The board provides the momentum to make the change. The principal himself or herself recognizes we need the change, combination, other considerations. This is an evolutionary thing. And, you know, when you go from revenue level X to Y or development level X to coming out of FDA, if it's an IND or it's, you know, it's a multi-phase clinical, you require a different skill set and discipline, capital, et cetera. And then, you know, and then you're in high gear. You've got production considerations, marketing considerations, organizational considerations. So I see it that there's a lot of turnover. I'm going to say that a company that gets to year 10 or 15 has had 3 CEOs. That would be my guess.
Okay, I'm just curious to see what your.
That's my perspective. Others may see it differently.
No, I tend to look through, depending on what stage the company is at, I look when I interview someone, if I'm going to bring them in a managerial role, the questions I would ask would determine their capability of dealing with change. If I don't see that, that tells me that they're caretakers, and that's going to be it. They're never going to build anything.
Is your perspective an investor perspective?
Both. I mean, if I'm representing the money, I'm going to interview that way as well. But I'm an operating manager, so I know the questions I'm going to want to ask, and I'm going to want to be looking at certain answers that tell me what the individual, how the individual thinks. And if I can't figure that out, or he can't articulate it to me, or she, then not the right person.
I would generally agree, but I also think that the complexion of these companies change. And
well, my comment was generic, not specific.
Clearly, these companies have to, management, board, C-suite execs got to get a little integrated, have an offsite meeting once a year to what's changed. I mean, we need these things.
When we diligence the management, say early on, we talk to the founders because they love their product and it's their baby. You don't want that founder syndrome where they stick around. So you ask questions to see if they're amenable to change, including sitting upstairs when it's time. It's really important because they don't have the skill sets, like you said, to move on.
I think that's exactly that exactly happens. That happens exactly when the next round of money comes in, because the next round of money is looking just like you're looking for a drug that's further along than a science project. The next round of money is looking at how the company can advance to the next round. So you have recognized the value of the developer, the innovator, inventor. You recognize that value, but that cycle is coming to a close and the company needs a different discipline. You're recognizing that, and typically that happens when there's a first meaningful round of capital coming in. All of a sudden, you're saying, well, can this guy really take the company from point X? Can this guy really, or this person, take the company from point X to point Y?
Last question.
Last question from the gentleman in the back.
Is there any scrutiny on the vendors carrying out the work? Oftentimes these small biotech teams, they have great, brilliant minds, they have a great mix, but if they have poor vendors, they can be overpaying, wasting time, and putting their project at risk.
No question about that. I think there's a big consideration of managing operating costs, and I think that's what you're alluding to.
Yes, and also cross-industry reputation. So certain vendors are terrible.
Yeah, things change. If you've got a vendor for a long time, you've got to ask yourself, is it working correctly?
Yeah.
I think part of the value out of what investors bring, the professional investor class, like VCs, private, is the value of partnerships, which will include that vendor class too. They may want to take somebody out, put somebody else in, et cetera. So, but it's intriguing. It's a bit of a puzzle. Great job, guys. Thanks so much.